This is 1968, a year of strife. 1968. It was a year of turmoil, a year of change, and a year of revolution throughout the world. In the next hour, we will look at this landmark year and how turmoil, change, and revolution helped define 1968. The touchstone story of the year, symbolizing that unrest, was the Vietnam War. There were two major developments in Vietnam in 1968, which ultimately helped change public perception of the war. One involved a major offensive by the North Vietnamese against U.S. soldiers and their South Vietnamese allies. And the other was a shocking, deadly U.S.-led assault on civilians living in a tiny village in South Vietnam.
"1968 seems to be the point where a lot of stuff that was coming to a boil for years blew up, where the combination of a quagmire war that wasn't going anywhere, racial tensions, generational falls. 1968 seemed to be a year when they all began to pay off in some very grim ways.
It crescendoed, and not only in the U.S., but in the world. From Paris to Czechoslovakia to the U.S., of course, to Vietnam.
Definitely newsworthy. It was frightening in many ways. It was one horrible news eruption after the other.
Almost every institution was challenged at some level, mostly by young people. And it's something that we are still trying to put together and wrap our minds around in terms of not just what happened, but the long-term impact.
Decades later, we are indeed still trying to understand 1968. It was truly a transformative year, which saw both the nation's preeminent civil rights leader and one of its leading politicians silenced by assassins. It saw a rise in activism among the young and among African Americans, all amidst the backdrop of a contentious presidential campaign, which would affect the political landscape in the years to come. Looming over all of this turmoil, there was the Vietnam War, a conflict which was becoming increasingly unpopular. In January, the United States was attempting to put a positive spin on that war. The battle which pitted the communist regime of North Vietnam and South Vietnamese insurgents, known as the Viet Cong, against the U.S. and the various anti-communist governments it supported in South Vietnam. President Lyndon Johnson had steadily increased the number of boots on the ground in Vietnam, from 23,000 in 1964 to over 530,000 U.S. combat troops by 1968. Their commander, General William Westmoreland, said they were winning easily against North Vietnam and its leader, Ho Chi Minh. The reality, however, was different. U.S. soldiers were slogging through a style of war they were unfamiliar with, guerrilla-style combat, which used the element of surprise to wear down the Americans and South Vietnamese. North Vietnam was also suffering due to incessant enemy aerial bombings. Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese needed a decisive battle victory in early 1968, so they decided on a bold attack during the Tet holiday in January.
The Tet holiday, which is the New Year in Vietnam, is far and away the biggest holiday in their culture. And in the previous years, even during the war would stop over the Tet holidays.
But that truce was broken with the Tet Offensive, launched on January 30th, 1968, when swarms of North Vietnamese soldiers and their Viet Cong allies launched simultaneous attacks on 100 cities and towns throughout South Vietnam, including large cities like Hue, Da Nang, and Saigon.
For if our intention is to restore...
CBS anchor Walter Cronkite was one of the many journalists who witnessed the Tet Offensive firsthand, spending early February in Hue.
Walter Cronkite was the most famous man in America, probably. And as an anchorman for several years, he had been reading news reports that were essentially drafted off of official accounts, press briefings that would come from Saigon and Washington. And he landed in Hue and saw for himself that that was a lie.
Cronkite delivered a rare personal commentary on the war in late February, after returning from Hue, where he said the war was unwinnable.
It is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could.
The Tet Offensive turned out to be a turning point in the perception of the war among Americans.
Tet was a disaster for the North and the Viet Cong. It was the worst military defeat they'd ever had. But what was clear was that the visceral image we saw on TV of gun battles in the embassy compound and in the streets of Saigon really suggested, okay, there is no light at the end of the tunnel.
By August 1968, Gallup polls showed for the first time that a majority of Americans believed the war was a mistake. And in Vietnam, the war was becoming bogged down under General Westmoreland's strategy of attrition. A strategy which emphasized high enemy casualty rates and ruthless search and destroy tactics. That strategy led to one of the most horrific chapters of the war, which occurred on March 16, 1968, when a group of the Army's 11th Infantry Brigade, known informally as Charlie Company, was ordered to root out Viet Cong in a search and destroy mission in the small village of My Lai. They found a group of unarmed women, children, and older men preparing breakfast. But Lieutenant William Kelly, acting on information that the entire village was connected to the Viet Cong, ordered his men to begin shooting the villagers. Over 500 people were killed, most of whom were women and children. A beleaguered Lyndon Johnson bore the brunt of criticism for this increasingly unpopular war. He responded by calling for a suspension to bombings in North Vietnam in March. But Johnson had one more bombshell, political in nature, which he would drop on America in the spring of 1968. Coming up, a tumultuous year in politics. Our look back at 1968 continues. In a normal election year, an incumbent president up for re-election wouldn't face any meaningful challenges from others in his party. But 1968 was not a normal year. Something that could be perceived by Beltway insiders like Jeff Greenfield, then a speechwriter for Robert Kennedy, the Democratic Senator of New York.
There was a sense even before the year began, mostly from Vietnam and then from the racial and generational upheaval, that we were in a tumultuous time. But I think as 1968 played out, there was this sense of just what else is going to happen?
The year began with a weakened Lyndon Johnson, reeling due to increased opposition to the Vietnam War. When primary season kicked off in New Hampshire on March 12th, Johnson had only one major opponent for the Democratic nomination, Minnesota Senator Eugene McCarthy. McCarthy had been critical of Johnson because of America's increased involvement in Vietnam. And the senator had support from younger anti-war activists.
The final campaigning is underway in the New Hampshire presidential primary.
Those activists helped McCarthy get a surprising 42% of the vote in New Hampshire, a figure which dismayed Johnson, who barely won the state with only 49% of the vote. Days later, longtime Johnson nemesis Robert Kennedy, a key member of John Kennedy's cabinet as Attorney General, announced that he was also entering the race for the Democratic presidential nomination.
I think the New Hampshire primary established that the division that exists in this country, the division that exists in the Democratic Party are there, that I haven't brought that about, that what has brought that about is the policies that are being followed by President Johnson.
Part of the Robert Kennedy fascination was simply the fact that he was the brother of a martyred president, that he'd been the second most powerful man in America and suddenly was consigned to the outer fringes because the incoming president and he just despised each other. That alone had an interesting dynamic.
A lot of people who loved President Kennedy viewed his younger brother Robert as the rightful heir to the White House. And so Johnson, I think, seeing all of these forces taking shape, decided that he didn't want to run for president again.
Johnson made that official on March 31st, 1968.
I have concluded that I should not permit the presidency to become involved in the partisan divisions that are developing in this political year. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
With Johnson's announcement, the Democratic race opened up into a three-man competition between Kennedy, McCarthy, and Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, who announced his candidacy after the president declined to run and immediately became a front-runner.
Back in those days, most of the delegates were picked by party insiders, bosses, and they were all going for Humphrey. And it was also clear that this was not going to be a walkover, this primary, because Bobby had, it's an unusual coalition given today's politics, but it was working class whites, blacks, and Hispanics. And the suburban type liberals, they were going for McCarthy.
It's a beginning in New Hampshire with a very smashing victory.
Meanwhile, the Republicans were led by a surprising name, former Vice President Richard Nixon, who had told the press that he'd never run again for public office after his defeats against John F. Kennedy in the 1960 presidential election, and Pat Brown in the 1962 California gubernatorial race. Other Republicans offered brief competition. Michigan Governor George Romney, New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, the leader of the GOP's moderate wing in the Northeast, and the rising conservative star of the Republican Party, California Governor Ronald Reagan.
What I can tell you is to blame for the breakdown of law and order. It's a group of militants and activists, revolutionaries, anarchists, and communists.
And both the Democrats and Republicans would have to contend with a strong third-party candidate. Alabama Governor George Wallace, an unapologetic segregationist and white supremacist. By June, Hubert Humphrey was the front-runner among the Democrats, and Robert Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy were making last-ditch efforts to secure delegates.
We are a great country, and a selfish country, and a compassionate country, and I intend to make that my basis for running and over the period of next year.
But Kennedy's campaign would be cut down on a June night at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles after winning the California primary. Just seconds after speaking to an adoring audience, Kennedy was killed by Sirhan Sirhan, a Palestinian assassin who felt betrayed by the senator's support for Israel in 1967's Six-Day War.
I was upstairs in the hotel. We were getting ready for a victory party. Somebody pointed out if the bullet had landed just a couple of inches differently against a harder part of his skull, he might have not only survived but been okay. But it was just, you know.
The Democratic Party, already divided, fell apart during its convention in August in Chicago. As expected, Hubert Humphrey secured the most delegates to become the Democrats' nominee. But the violent clashes between Chicago police and protesters a few miles from where the convention took place.
And with George McGovern as President of the United States, we wouldn't have to have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago.
Along with bitter floor fights inside the convention hall among supporters of Humphrey, McCarthy, and South Dakota Senator George McGovern, proved to be too toxic for the Democrats.
This time we're going to win.
Meanwhile, Nixon won the Republican nomination, promoting himself as the so-called law and order candidate.
It appears a deadlock has been avoided, but the race remains extremely close.
The popular vote had Nixon slightly ahead of Humphrey, but Nixon won by carrying 32 states in the Electoral College, compared to Humphrey's 13 states and the District of Columbia, while Wallace carried 5 states in the South.
I, as you probably have heard, have received a very gracious message from the Vice President congratulating me for winning the election.
Coming up, young activists become a major voice through public protest. As we look back at the year 1968. In 1968, the children of the so-called greatest generation and silent generation were young adults. These were the baby boomers, a generation whose birth years began in the mid-1940s. This was the generation fighting a controversial war thousands of miles away in Southeast Asia. And this was the generation protesting that war on college campuses throughout America and in the streets of the country's urban areas. Those young protesters were influenced partly by the civil rights movement, which began in the mid-1950s.
I'd been a community organizer. I was radicalized myself, just a Midwest girl, not out of any political radical background at all, when Dr. King came to Chicago. And I went as a law student and worked on the west side of Chicago and had my eyes open to one reality.
The country had turned against the war, so by 1968, we were in the majority. We were no longer a minority with a moral outrage. And so we felt that we had to escalate, since we'd already won the popular argument.
There were a number of youth activist groups, like the Students for a Democratic Society, or the SDS, a radical left-wing organization formed on the University of Michigan's campus in the early 1960s.
Our rhetoric was often impolite and bombastic and pretentious, but the moral imperative that drove people around opposing racism and white supremacy, opposing permanent war, and being for participatory democracy, those 3 ideas were worth fighting for.
And now, here's Yippee!
Then there was the Youth International Party, better known as the Yippies, a colorful, radicalized, and politicized update of the hippie movement, led by Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, and Paul Krasner, which utilized street theater and politically themed pranks to get their point across.
I just like the spirit of the Yippies, that it was, rather than saying we're going to have a long march through the institution, the slogan was abandon the creeping meatball. And that this whole, what we saw as a stultifying way of life, there was another kind of more promising counterculture way of life.
Groups like these began to make an impact early in 1968. Starting in April, when SDS activists and other protesters at Columbia University in New York City began a nonviolent occupation of campus buildings that lasted nearly a week, after it was revealed that a university think tank was providing consultation to the U.S. Department of Defense. Protesters were also rallying against what they considered the racist expansion of the university into Harlem, the longtime African-American neighborhood in Upper Manhattan.
We thought that the entire system underlying the war in Vietnam and underlying racism could be changed merely because a small group of people wanted to change it. I was 20 years old. What can a 20-year-old know?
Events like these called for a new type of journalism, one that the traditional media wasn't providing. That's where the underground press came in. By 1968, there were hundreds of these counterculture newspapers around the country, distributed on college campuses and in the major urban areas, like the East Village Other in New York, the Berkeley Barb in California's Bay Area, and the Chicago Seed, whose editor was future Rolling Stone journalist Abe Peck.
The papers were very white, they were very male. There were some very good journalists there within that, but they reported from what's called a frame in sociology. They looked through that frame and they saw crazy kids or dissidents or unpatriotic kids. So we felt that we needed these counterpapers, and they went from 5 in 1966 to 500 to 1,000 by 1968.
Peck's Chicago Seed provided crucial on-the-ground coverage during the seminal event for activists in 1968. The street protests during the Democratic National Convention in Chicago.
Every day, people kept coming back, get driven out at night. A lot of the kids who came were neighborhood kids who were just fascinated with it. They weren't political, and they were a little tougher, and they kind of fought back. And the thing I never forgot, for all I know, this guy could have been a provocateur, but he was a guy who was a seed seller, and he picked up a garbage can and threw it through the windshield of a police car. And that, to me, was a marker that there had been a sea change.
Chicago Mayor Richard Daley deployed 12,000 police officers and called in another 15,000 state and federal officers to contain the thousands of protesters. But images of these young activists and innocent bystanders being beaten and gassed by authorities were an international phenomenon. Coming up, a new assertiveness among African Americans protesting for their civil rights. This is the year 1968. The African American experience has been a unique one in United States history. And in 1968, Black Americans were witnessing change on an epic level. For generations, African Americans had been disenfranchised in the United States, living in a country where racial segregation was accepted in just about every aspect of American life. But 1968 was a watershed year. It was a year when President Johnson signed the last major legislative achievement of the Civil Rights era, the Fair Housing Act, addressing racial discrimination in housing. That came after Johnson's signing of the historic Civil Rights Act in 1964, which outlawed discrimination against African Americans, and the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which eliminated legal barriers keeping blacks from exercising the right to vote. Civil rights leader Martin Luther King was a key influence behind these legislative achievements. But in 1968, he had broadened his horizons.
My views on the draft are very clear. I'm against it.
Including protesting against the war in Vietnam.
He felt a sense of pressure because many of his allies were for the war on poverty at home, but not willing to fight to end the war in Vietnam.
King's major effort in 1968 was to address economic inequality in the United States by staging a march on Washington in the spring. But the civil rights leader would not live to see the march.
Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee.
King was killed while standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. where he had been with other civil rights activists, including Jesse Jackson, to support garbage workers in a strike.
I did the first press conference trying to describe what we had seen. It was very difficult to describe. I remember saying, I think white America has lost the best friend it ever had.
Riots broke out in over 100 cities, the bitter reaction to the violent death of a non-violent activist. Meanwhile, King's Poor People's March went on over a period of weeks in May and June, with Jackson, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and others leading the way. It was a tribute to King's last dream of a multi-ethnic, multi-racial movement. There was a new assertiveness among African American activists, symbolized by the rise of the Black Panther Party, a revolutionary group with chapters in dozens of American cities. The Black Panthers did not advocate non-violent protest like King. They were armed and advocated self-defense, speaking out against police brutality.
In America, black people are treated very much as the Vietnamese people or any other colonized people because we're brutalized.
And in 1968, the group's co-founder, Huey Newton, was convicted of manslaughter in the killing of an Oakland police officer, a conviction that was later overturned.
The Panthers were wrongly depicted in the media by and large as these thugs, as these gangbangers, as these black racists, none of which was true. They were saying things that truly threatened the fabric of society in the sense of they wanted revolutionary change.
That desire for change was shared among younger African Americans, who by 1968 had begun shedding the old word used to define their race, Negro. They began using the term black.
It was a sudden thing. It literally was a revolutionizing phenomenon. To go to bed one night as a Negro and to walk through that next day as somebody who was black, and ultimately to evolve into an Afro-American and then an African-American, was a transition that literally changed people's perceptions, not just of themselves, but of the world.
Harry Edwards was 25 years old in 1968, a former college athlete. He was launching his career as an academic and as a civil rights activist, with an interest in using sports as a platform for protest. His main influence was Muhammad Ali, who was on a hiatus from boxing in 1968 after being stripped of his boxing license for refusing to be inducted into the armed forces.
He literally set the model, set the standard for athlete reaction to social issues. He was the godfather of the revolt of the black athlete.
Edwards was following the same path as Ali, organizing a planned boycott of a football game at San Jose State University in 1967 as part of a protest against segregated housing and other issues on campus. That led to his creation of an organization called the Olympic Project for Human Rights, a group designed for the specific purpose of boycotting the 1968 Summer Olympics in Mexico City.
The International Olympic Committee had never had a black head coach in track and field, as great as black athletes had been. The same with regard to basketball and other sports where black athletes had excelled.
The boycott among black Olympic athletes didn't happen. But what did happen at the 1968 Summer Games turned out to be one of the indelible moments of the year. Track and field athletes Tommy Smith and John Carlos, two friends of Edwards from San Jose State and members of the Olympic Project on Human Rights, finished first and third, respectively, in the 200-meter sprint finals. As the United States national anthem played, the two men on the winner's podium wore black gloves and raised their fists in protest in a Black Power salute, a gesture which outraged International Olympic Committee President Avery Brundage, who told the U.S. Olympic Committee to send the two athletes home as punishment.
Smith and Carlos were told to leave the Olympic Village and Mexico within 48 hours. They were both stunned at the decision, but retained their composure.
How will this affect the rest of the black athletes on the United States Olympic team, other black athletes on Olympic teams around the world?
Well, I don't think it's going to affect them in any way. I think it's going to affect the United States Olympic team now, because I think they will have demonstrations coming from all ends, not only from the United States, but all over the world.
Of course, afterwards, everybody associated with the Olympic Project for Human Rights, especially Smith and Carlos, were condemned, castigated, cut off from opportunities, and so forth. But there was a price to pay for having the audacity, the courage, the intellect, and commitment to challenge conventional thinking. And Carlos and Smith paid a heck of a price.
Coming up, from Paris to Prague, the revolution is televised around the world as we look back at 1968. (1968) was also a year of turmoil and rebellion throughout the world. That turmoil was present throughout Europe, where violent clashes between young activists and authorities mirrored similar confrontations in the United States, and where a brief period of political liberalization in communist-led Czechoslovakia was ultimately quashed by the Soviet Union. The year began with strife between the United States and a Cold War nemesis, North Korea, a communist ally of the Soviet Union since the end of World War II. In January, the USS Pueblo, a Navy intelligence vessel, was doing a routine surveillance of the North Korean coast, traveling in international waters, when it was intercepted by North Korean patrol boats. A firefight ensued, killing one of the crew members. The 82 other Pueblo crew members were then taken as prisoners.
The North Koreans seized a small U.S. naval vessel in international waters and took it into a North Korean port. Now, that is a matter of the utmost gravity, and we're following up on that through the channels that are available to obtain the immediate release of the ship and its crew.
But the crew would remain captive for the next 11 months. Meanwhile, in Europe, the spring of 1968 was a time for mass protest. In France, leftist students joined forces with millions of striking laborers who were protesting for higher wages and improved working conditions.
There may be a peace conference going on in Paris, but right here in the Latin Quarter, there's a war between the police and the students.
The result was a series of violent protests in May, with students and workers briefly occupying universities, businesses, and other French institutions. Hundreds were injured, and the rebellion almost brought down the French government before it was stifled.
Paris was a political event which was different. It had a worker-student alliance, which people tried to do in 1968 and 69 on the left in America. But Paris also had this tremendous countercultural element, and we were certainly attracted to that.
The Czechs are queuing up to explore their newfound freedom. Freedom to talk, criticize, write, or read about anything they choose.
In Czechoslovakia, the so-called Prague Spring of 1968 involved the celebration of a reformist government led by Alexander Dubček, who became head of the Czech Communist Party in early 1968.
Long live May 1st, and that is Mr. Dubček, Alexander Dubček, first secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, and President Svoboda.
The Dubček government ended censorship in the country and was planning further reforms. But in August, the Soviet Union decided to clamp down on Czechoslovakia, which it claimed as a satellite state. The U.S. condemned the invasion, but did not intervene. And despite active resistance from the Czechs, the Soviets ousted Dubček and re-established control over the country. A control it was able to maintain for another 20 years. The year ended with resolution in the USS Pueblo crisis, with North Korea finally agreeing to release the captive Americans, in exchange for a reluctant confession signed by the United States admitting that the ship intruded into North Korean territory.
But my signature will not and cannot alter the facts. I will sign the document to free the crew and only to free the crew.
After 11 months in captivity, 2 days after their release, after one of the strangest episodes in diplomatic history, the crew of the USS Pueblo has come home.
The Pueblo crew finally came home on Christmas Eve, 1968. But their still commissioned ship remains in North Korea to this day, on display at a war museum in Pyongyang, the legacy of a contentious year throughout the world, and the symbol of still unresolved hostilities between two vastly different nations. Coming up, major developments in space exploration as we continue our journey back to 1968. "1968 was a year of social and political change throughout the world. But arguably the most important developments of this incredible year occurred not on land, but in the last great frontier, space. As man inched ever closer to understanding some of the mysteries of the cosmos.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
The goal of NASA's Apollo program was to realize President John F. Kennedy's plan. But in early 1968, that plan seemed unlikely.
The observers report that there was what I would call a flash fire, which originated inside the cabin.
The program had a major setback in 1967, when the entire crew of Apollo 1 was killed by a cabin fire in a pre-launch test. The tragedy forced NASA to do a complete redesign of their spacecraft's command module. And after launching a few unmanned flights, the agency attempted a manned spacecraft orbit of the Earth.
5, 4, 3, 2, we have ignition. Commit liftoff. We have liftoff.
Slowly, slowly.
This was Apollo 7, which was successfully launched on October 11th, 1968. The spacecraft spent the next 10 days in low Earth orbit.
Roger, good morning to everyone in television land. You're looking at the right-hand portion of the main display console.
Its astronauts did the first live TV broadcast from a U.S. spacecraft. And although the crew was irritated with that task, and plagued with head colds that lingered with them throughout their time in space. It was a successful mission. And it led to a more ambitious undertaking, slated for the end of the year. This was Apollo 8, which was NASA's first attempt to have a manned spacecraft orbit around the moon. A 6-day mission instigated by the CIA, which incorrectly assumed that the Soviets were already making plans to do so. Apollo 8 would be groundbreaking, not only because of its mission, but because its crew at NASA's Mission Control in Houston included its first female engineer, a 25-year-old University of Texas graduate, Frances Poppy Northcutt.
The program that I worked on was the development of the return to Earth capability. The main goal was to get them back alive as far as I was concerned. That was the whole goal for the whole program, get them back alive.
On December 21st, 1968, at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, astronauts William Anders, Jim Lovell, and Frank Borman entered into their module, which would be powered by the Saturn V rocket, the most powerful rocket ever built to that date.
2, 1, 0.
It's a beautiful takeoff so far. This building is shaking under us. Our camera platform is shaking. If all continues to go well.
Early on Christmas Eve, the spacecraft reached its destination.
The moon is a different thing to each one of us. I know my own impression is that it's a vast, lonely, forbidding type existence.
And William Anders took the opportunity to take one of the most indelible images of the 20th century. A photo of the Earth taken while Apollo 8 was orbiting around the moon.
As soon as we were able to look and see the full Earth through the windows of the spacecraft, particularly as we saw it coming up over the lunar horizon for the first Earthrise, you really knew that that was home planet.
Apollo 8 didn't land on the moon. NASA hadn't finished developing landing gear for such a mission.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
But it was an important precursor to the first moon landing, done by Apollo 11 the following summer.
NASA's little geologist Sojourner freewheeled onto the surface of Mars, a sort of robotic Neil Armstrong.
And it was an important forerunner to dozens of space missions since.
It paved the way for all of the rest. Absolutely paved the way for all of the rest.
Apollo 8 also provided much-needed hope to the world after a tumultuous year. Hope symbolized by a unifying holiday message issued by Frank Borman on Christmas Eve.
And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
While 1968 ended on an optimistic note with the successful mission of Apollo 8, the news from Vietnam continued to be bleak. 1968 ended up being the bloodiest year in the war, with over 180,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese killed, along with almost 28,000 South Vietnamese and nearly 17,000 Americans. That'll do it for us today. I'm Bill Curtis. As we leave, one last look back at the year 1968.